Hello everybody and welcome to the Aurelia 2 crash course video. I'm Dwayne and I'm a member of the Aurelia core team. I've been a member since 2016, so 6 years, and Aurelia debuted in 2015, and I can remember it well because it came at a time when React was really picking up steam. Angular was discussing version 2 and no migration path, and Angular really rubbed a lot of developers the wrong way when they basically said new version, no upgrade path. um, Basically stick with what you have or use something else or upgrade to version 2. So Aurelia kind of came at this interesting time where things weren't really set in stone just yet. Webpack was all but a little dot in the grand scheme of things in the front end community. But sadly, you're probably watching this and you may have heard of Aurelia, you may not have heard of it in some time, you may not have heard of it at all. It's been around 7 years now, and version 2 is just about to release. You could be watching this video as Aurelia 2 is released, but even though it's in alpha at the moment, all the concepts and benefits that we talk about in this video, they still apply to whatever version of Aurelia 2 that you're using right now. It's probably even better than when we talk about it in this video, but who knows? I'm biased, so let's get into it. Why would you choose Aurelia? We're on the Aurelia webpage here, and we'll just make this really brief. But basically, the benefits, the value add is it's easy to learn. The performance is great. There's no virtual DOM in Aurelia. A lot of developers have been conditioned to believe that virtual DOM is essential for performance, but on the contrary, the virtual DOM can actually introduce performance bottlenecks. And rarely all that kind of stuff. It's rarely the bottleneck in an application. It's usually poorly optimized code, poorly optimized images and HTML and bloated DOMs that cause those kind of issues. So, a lot of those performance points that frameworks and libraries make, it's a bit of a moot point because they're all fast, they're all good. No matter if it's Aurelia, Angular, whatever, they'll get the job done. It's got good support for working in editors and whatnot. IntelliSense, there's a Chrome debugger plugin. A lot of plugins for Aurelia 2 and Aurelia in general have actually been created by the core team. So, unlike other options out there where there may be more to pick from, it makes it more difficult. And let's be honest, a lot of those libraries, especially in React, they just get abandoned after a few months or a couple of years on GitHub. You come across so many abandoned repositories that just aren't updated anymore because of the lack of conventions and, you know, all that kind of stuff we'll get into with Aurelia and explain why I believe it makes it one of the best choices for building a modern web application. Then obviously we get into that down here, effortless coding with conventions. Basically, Aurelia, unlike other choices out there, it does some things by default. And if you're not happy with how those are, then what you can do is you can say, well, I want to override those conventions. And that's that. The framework doesn't fight you at all. It comes working a certain way out of the box. And to be honest, in my experience building with Aurelia, I've been working with it for 7 years since it launched in 2015 and joined the core team in 2016. I've shipped a lot of apps, and largely I don't touch those conventions because they just work. They work how you would probably want to work in most situations. So it's just really handy not having to explicitly tell Aurelia that I'm building a component or a directive slash, custom attribute, whatever it's called in your framework or library. So we'll kind of go away from this now. We'll head over to the documentation real quick because this kind of gives it a better overview of, how Aurelia works, its templating syntax, and why you would use it. So if we go into this Hello World example, you'll actually see that it's really simple. We don't install anything. We use npx makes Aurelia. So npx is a node package execution command. If you have Node.js installed, you have npx. Makes is a package basically that allows you to call a scaffolding repo in this interesting situation with the Aurelia one. And basically it gives you a CLI without having to install one. So you can see in the case of this Hello World component, it's literally a class. Now I know classes in front end are a contentious subject, and Some people have opinions on them, believe that functional components are the only way, and no side effects and all that. And we won't get into that, but obviously Angular uses classes as well. And I'm one of those people that believe that if you use something the right way, there's no wrong way. I've seen people get into messes with pure functions as well. So really about just being mindful of how you code. And Aurelia doesn't, make you use inheritance or anything like that. You're exporting a single class for a component, and that's that. There's no mess. There's no banana jungle, whatever that analogy is when people talk about object-oriented programming. It's nothing like that whatsoever. You can see it's just a class. This property here, message, we can access that within our template. So you'll actually see on this next line, this little code example here of a $sign and then 2 curlies. You might be, if you worked with Vue before, you might be familiar with the double curly brackets, opening and close, to print out a value in your template. Well, Aurelia actually uses the template literal syntax. So if you look up template literals in JavaScript, and you may have actually used template literals inside JavaScript code, you can create these, backtick strings, and then inside to print out JavaScript values in there, variables and whatnot, uses $sign and then curly. So Aurelia is unique in that aspect because it takes a concept that you might already be familiar with if you're up to date with modern JavaScript and use template literals, and you possibly have because they've been around for 7 years now. 2015, yes, 2015 is when they were introduced. So we'll move on from that. That's our little component there. And sorry, we skipped over a little part at the end there, but you can see that we've got another little component here, and it looks largely the same. So like a hello name component. Yeah. And then we've got a little template here, once again, $sign and the curlies to print it out. Nothing really different. But then if we get down to here, you can see we've got another little example where we're using value.bind, then passing a name. Well, basically, in Aurelia, form elements can bind to values inside of your component view models. So that name value that we defined up here, in the previous step, by going value.bind, it's taking the native value property on this text input here, and it's storing that value in our view model. It's setting it. It's like setting the variable, basically. So in this example, if you were to type into that little input, it would be updating that value. And because Aurelia has a reactive binding system, we don't have to use, a change callback on this or anything. It knows this value has changed and it would automatically update it. Now that's a convention behavior that you would want in most cases, but you can explicitly tell Aurelia that you don't want that reactive behavior using a binding behavior called onetime, which basically says, show this value, don't show it again. If you've got this UI where you're counting on input changing values in a dynamic way, you wouldn't want to use that, but that's that. So I think there's actually a working example here of this hello name component, and it's a little bit better to explain. We did just go over this, but if we go, Wayne, you can see in this example, it's basically the code we just looked at. It's reactive. And you can type super fast, and it works. Delete it. Perfect. So if we can access the code in this example, the hello name component, you'll actually see the one, hello name.html. This view here is being rendered by this. So we can say hola dead. And Dwayne, hola Dwayne. That because value.bind to name is updating this property right here. Super simple. You notice how we didn't even have to tell Aurelia inside our component. This is a reactive property. It just knows. Now, I did mention before a binding behavior, and we won't go getting into too much detail on this, but if you go one time on this, hola person, then if we go, doesn't work. That's saying set it and forget it, basically. You would use that in instances where you want to display values and you don't want them to be reactive, but in the case of this example, we definitely want it to be reactive. So show you removing that works, and that's that. I mean, it's a pretty simple hello world example here, and you kind of get the gist of that. So you can already see the benefits of working with Aurelia from a developer experience perspective. Binding to values and form inputs and whatnot, it's super simple, and it carries through to the rest of the framework as well, as we'll kind of see as we skip over this stuff. So we've already gone over displaying values with interpolation. You can see we can do expressions in there as well. So we can go, $ curly 2 plus 2, similar to what you can do in template literals. I don't know if they have that example on here, but they probably do. Yeah, look, they've got something here. On this log here. Oh, sorry, here's a better example. You can see we've got an expression in here. It's going $ expression. Aurelia carries that convention through to its template. So you can see here it's not trying to be anything other than trying to, get closer to the actual specification, JavaScript specification. And not only that, but a really cool thing about it is we can use all these optional syntaxes here, like, nullish color scheme and all that kind of stuff, which is really, really cool for writing concise conditionals inside your templates and not having to use if statements or anything like that you might have to in another framework or library. We got into some of these little bindings down here. So you can see we've got value.bind. There is a more expressive way that you can bind to things. So two-way basically says this value can update in two directions. So from the view model to the view, but it can also go from the view to the view model. Now, you may have noticed on that example before, it was going from the view to the view model. From that input. That's because Aurelia, for form input values, it treats them as two-way by default. So the reason it does that is because it assumes that a form with bindable values is updating properties inside of a view model. So say you have a login form, you want a username and password field, you want those values in your code so you can call an API and do, what you would do with a traditional form. But you can explicitly say you don't want it to do that, and you can say I only want it to go from one direction, but if it updated in the view model for whatever reason, that wouldn't update in the UI. So really simple. And you can also see here for images, we're binding to the native source attribute, which is an actual attribute on that image element. Now, what Aurelia does, which is really, really cool, is besides the syntax being super straightforward, I mean, .bind is really easy to remember. We're binding to native properties. So if you're aware of how to work with an image element already, it has a source property, it has an alt property, it has a bunch of different properties that you could update. If it's in the spec on that element, then you can just do .bind and happy days. Which makes it really intuitive because you don't have to go consulting the framework and documentation and wondering how you would dynamically update a value on an image element. You can see here for buttons, the native disabled attribute. Once again, .bind. So far everything we've seen with this templating binding syntax is being .bind, which is the default binding behavior inside of templates. Once again, like that component we saw before, the person one, where we entered a value, we've got a value in here that disable button equals true. So if you were to bind that value in, that button would be disabled using the, just the native disabled attribute. You can also bind to the native inner HTML and text content attributes as well. Now, these, once again, they're actual proper, web specification attributes. There's an inner HTML and a text content. You may have used these in JavaScript, obviously in a different way. Obviously text content, usually written in that camel case approach, and similarly with inner HTML as well. But, just remember inside of templates, everything is flat. We can create custom elements with bindable values, which is really cool. So you can have a custom element, maybe an element to display an image or a form or something like that. You can have custom little values, And that's just telling Aurelia that these are values that can be dynamic and user supplied. So, components or templating syntax is really, really simple. Once again, we saw this already with that example in the Hello World section. Components can just be a simple class, export class, blah, blah, blah. And then similarly with the convention in Aurelia, by default, it will assume that there's a view model, a .ts or a .js file, depending on if you're working with JavaScript or TypeScript, and then a HTML file of the same name. So it does a file name match here. So you can see app loader is the same name. The file extension is different. Aurelia will go and look for the HTML file, but you can override that and say it doesn't have a HTML file. It may be an inline template that you define inside of your view model, and that's fine. But the convention by default is that it expects these two files to be there, basically. You can't have a view model without a view unless you tell it that you don't want one, which is what you would do with this custom element decorator. So I mentioned the conventions, but if you don't want to use conventions for custom elements, once again, we've got an intuitively named decorator called custom element. It takes two properties. There actually are other properties for this, but we won't get into those. Name is the tag name, so all lowercase and then hyphen separated. Call that kebab case. So app loader is the attribute name that you would reference in the HTML when you're using it. Template could be a string that you define inside of your view model here, but you can see we're importing a HTML file, passing it to that. That's effectively doing what this is doing by default, which is really cool. So you can see time-saving convention. And here we go. Look, here's a situation where we don't have a view template at all. We've got apploader.ts, but we don't have a .html file. That's because we've told it, well, here's our template here. We don't have a matching file. So that's really, really cool. You can see we've got some other properties here. You can explicitly define dependencies. You don't have to do this. You can import them inside of your HTML components or register them globally to access them as well. Components can also be HTML only. So sometimes your components are so simple that they don't need a view model because, there's nothing really programmatically happening. It's mostly markup. In the case of a loading component, you might only want to show and hide a div if a value is true, false in there. So in that, you can actually define a bindable property. So you can see for this loader component, we're referencing it, loading.bind, passing in a Boolean property. We defined that inside of our HTML only component here. And we told it that its name is loading in there. So that's what we reference it. So that matches up to that. Now that is where earlier up in our template, we had a bindable property inside of our template. I don't think actually it wasn't here. But basically, that's just telling it that we have a user supplied value in there, which is really, really cool. So we've got some stuff in here about registering components and whatnot through dependency injection. You don't have to worry about that. Custom attributes. Now, if you've worked with other frameworks like Angular and whatnot, they go by other names. You may know these as directives. But an attribute is basically a value that decorates an element. So you may have a custom attribute to add functionality to an existing custom element or a div or a button or whatever. So you can see in this example here, we've got a rather useless custom attribute called red square. And what this is actually doing is any element that we put that on, it's going to turn our element into a square that's red. That's all it's going to do. You can see we did it on a div, called it red square, and that's denoted by the naming convention here, a red square custom attribute. Now, unlike custom elements, we have to tell it it's a custom attribute by adding custom attribute on the name of the class on the end there, or we can actually call this custom attribute decorator to tell it that it's red square. Once again, all lowercase and kebab cased as well. So really, really cool because we can use that to access the element that we're using that on, as you can see in this example here, we just inject the node that it's being used on, and then we can access the element that the attribute's being used on. So in our example, we're obviously using that to modify the style of the element. Really, really cool. And similarly for custom attributes, you can have multiple properties that a user could specify. So our first example of the red square was, it was a red square. You couldn't change any of the properties. But you can actually see in this example here, using the bindable attribute, we're allowing them to change the color and size of it as well. So you can make a bigger square or a smaller square. And the really cool thing about bindables is by default, once again, conventions kicking, the name of the property here will call a change handler function if it exists with changed on the end. So you can see the name is color and that's it there, but we've just add changed on the end. So Aurelia will look for this function if it exists and it will call it. You'll get the new value and the old value if it exists. Otherwise it'd be undefined in there. Same thing for size. So size changed. That's just a default convention. You can actually change that as well. So you can tell Aurelia that you want to call a different function name, which is completely fine. You can override that, change callback if you want, but in most cases, there's no need to. I think the intent and the relationship to the bindable value by using the name, the change convention, it works really well. Then we have value converters. So value converters, if you've worked with other frameworks, you may know these as pipes. Basically, you can use them to modify a value inside of your view. You can also use it on bindable properties as well. So say someone was entering a value into a text input, you could actually modify that value in real time and make it say, uppercase or whatever. Something silly. You can also see in this example, we'll skip over that one there. We're using a date formatting function. So we're just calling the, native little API here. Format the date of a value. So you can see we define it here. We have a function here, toView. So value converters have two different functions that you can define. It's toView or fromView. And going back to what we were talking about binding values before, toView is obviously if the value is being set from the view model and shown in the view. And fromView is when the value is being modified and passed back to the view model. Really cool thing about this is you can format a value to display differently than how it's stored in the property. So really cool example of that is dates. So here we can see toView. We're formatting the date to look nice. It's going to be like a nice proper little date string here, June 20, 2021. But you can see the value that we're passing into it is, a date time object here. It's anything but nice. You may actually want to store the value as this. You don't want to format it and then change the way it works because you might be storing it back into a database that expects a certain format. So we can just tell it to modify the value for display using toView. But if you had a date picker component, for example, you would have a fromView value converter callback in here, which basically converts that value back to how you might be saving it. And just like bindable properties inside of a custom attribute or a custom element, we can have properties. So these can be configurable. So you can see in this example, we're actually allowing you to set the locale on the date time string conversion. And we actually have a working code example here. So you can see in here, we've got our value converter and we're formatting it in all these different date formats in here, which is really, really cool. And it's just this code here that's doing that. So we're doing it for formatting for date purposes. And the way that Aurelia gets that value is on the to and from view functions that you define inside your value converter. The first value is always the value from the view or to the view. Always the value. But then any additional arguments after that are the configuration property. So you can have multiple of these. We could have more arguments on this function, and they would line up to be properties passed in on this. So really, really simple. And also one important thing to touch upon is think like other frameworks and libraries that have this concept. We're still using a pipe. It's definitely, the vertical pipe in there. Except Aurelia just calls them value converters, but they're pipes or whatever you want to call them. We talked about this before as well, and we'll just briefly touch upon it. But Aurelia makes working with forms really, really simple. So we talked about how values inside of form elements, they're two-way binding by default. So the value changes in the view or the view model, it will update on these properties by default, which is how we want it to be. It's a really nice little login component example, going value.bind to the password and value.bind to the email. That's it. You can see we've got those properties on there, and happy days. You can also bind to other types of inputs, so not just input, text elements. We can do text area. We can do checkboxes. We can do arrays. We can also work with different types of values on those elements as well. Super, super simple stuff. We will skip over this because, going through the documentation will be obviously up to you, the viewer. But as you can see, it just makes working with different types of values on all kinds of inputs just a breeze. You don't have to use, convoluted callback functions or anything like that. It just works. And it's all very well documented. So select elements in there as well. Simple stuff. Similarly, we've also got ease of use when it comes to working with inline styles and classes. So we can actually tell it to apply certain class values based on a Boolean property passed in by going the class name dot class. It's a really cool convention. It's new to Aurelia 2. This wasn't in Aurelia 1. Basically, it's just a way to dynamically add classes to and from elements in there. Super simple stuff. We won't have to go into too much detail on that. It's self-explanatory, especially if you've worked with Angular or another framework. Similar, it's just as easy for inline styles. So binding to the background property, native CSS property, background.style, and we're passing in a value in there. So that's turning blue, and we can bind to multiple styles. We can work with conditional rendering of data really easy. Show and hide elements is if.bind. Once again, there's that .bind paradigm. We've got else statements in there as well. We can show or hide elements. So using show.bind, they won't be pulled out of the page. It's just the equivalent of doing a display none, basically. We've got support for switch case statements. I haven't really used this feature yet, but I think it's pretty cool. I tend to just kind of stick to if bind, basically, but it works the same way. A big important part of working with any framework library is working with collections of data and displaying them. So a really good example is an array of items, products, users, whatever. You want to loop over those in your view and display them. Say you had an array of objects. This is a really good example here. Items is an array, and it's similar. If you look at the syntax here, it's actually similar to a JavaScript for of loop. Once again, Aurelia doesn't add any weird new templating syntax or paradigms. You'll actually notice a lot of this framework leverages concepts that you've already used in JavaScript before. It's actually quite amazing to me, even after all these years, just how easy Aurelia makes this stuff. Unlike other frameworks as well, you don't have to go passing in keys or anything like that for performance. Aurelia is really good at keeping track of all that stuff behind the scenes. So working with lists is just a real trait. To go repeat.for, then item of items. So if you've done a for of loop in JavaScript, you'll remember the syntax really, really easily. It'll just click for you. We've got some contextual properties in there inside our view, so we can get the index, whether it's the first or last item, even, odd. We can get the length, and we can also access outside of the loop as well, because Aurelia creates its own context inside of loops. And look, there you go. There's our array with our objects in there that we're using for this example. You can also use the create number ranges as well. So if you want a list of like 100 numbers, you could just go, variable name of 10. Do 10, or you could do 100 or whatever there. The repeating syntax also works with maps, and it also works with sets as well, it's just incredible. I don't really work with those formats too much, but it's really, really nice to know that they're in there. We've got event handling. So another big thing, I would say in an application, two of the biggest things that you do are rendering items using repeats, or iterators, whatever you want to call them, and event handling. So you want to know when a button is clicked. You want to know when someone moves their mouse over something. When someone does anything with the keyboard or mouse, you want to listen to that event. In Aurelia, there's 3 different ways to do that. You have delegate, trigger, and capture. I can tell you right now that in most cases, you just want to use trigger. So trigger is like the equivalent of add event listener in JavaScript. The equivalent of this would be going, document query select a button dot add event listener click. So click trigger, and then we pass in the function name, which is defined inside of our view model. Now with delegate, you do want to use that sometimes. You just got to be careful because you may already be familiar with the concept of delegates, so not a new concept or Aurelia specific. A delegate is basically finding a common ancestor and then setting up an event listener on that, and then listening for any events inside of that element. So if you have a list with 10,000 items and you want to have a click event, it's probably better to use a delegate in that example instead of listening to 10,000 add event listeners. You don't have to be a genius developer to know that that would just be a bad idea. Cool thing about this as well is Aurelia automatically takes care of the cleanup, so you don't have to dispose of anything. It just does it, which is really, really cool. Aurelia has support for Lambda expressions as well. I'm not sure if other, similar frameworks like Angular or anything like that have this. Possible they do. But you can see in here, we can call .filter on this array just straight inside the template and have a little callback function here. I mean, previously in Aurelia 1, you would have to create a value converter to do this. But now you can do logic inside of your templates, and it's a really, really cool feature that they've added in there. So lots of fun you can have with that one. It doesn't support everything in there, but it does support, a lot of the basics basically that you would be using it for. More event listener type stuff in there. Notes on valid uses of Lambda expressions. You can see we can use a reduce in our templates as well. So if you had like a total, as in this example, it's a really good example of products, and you just wanted the total, you're summing up the price basically. It's a really good example. Template references are basically allow you to put a ref element on any element in your templates, components, give it a name, and you can actually reference that. It's just basically aliasing elements to be, referenced by value in here. So template variables, we've already seen, I guess, expressions in our views, but we can do inline variables as well. So you can use this let element here to define an inline template variable. Now, you may notice here we're using let. Once again, if you've worked with JavaScript, you know what the let keyword is to define variables. That's probably what you're doing. The community's largely moved away from using var in most cases. We've got local template support, so you can create custom elements inside your elements. Really cool if you've got some reusable code in there, but it's only specific to that view. Create a local template and then reference it. Really cool stuff, really simple. One of my favorite features is template promises. So previously, if you're working with promises, you would kind of resolve them and assign the values inside your view models. In some cases, it doesn't make any sense to have that boilerplate. You're just calling a function to get products or whatever from an API. You may actually want to do that in your views instead. Now, I don't use this a whole lot just yet, and I wouldn't go just using it in place of doing stuff inside view models, but it is a really cool feature to have in certain instances where your promise use is quite simplistic and it doesn't make sense to have the boilerplate in your view model. So you can see we've got all the different states. Pending means it hasn't resolved. Then we've got then and catch, and we're just using from view in here for the bindings for those. Really cool stuff. Dynamic composition. It's one of my favorite features of Aurelia, and I don't believe even Angular has this kind of power of composition like what Aurelia has. Basically, you can use it to dynamically compose UI, and I don't mean creating components and then rendering those. You can actually dynamically create markup in your application. So you can see we can pass in a view model or a view in there, and it basically negates the need of creating components. We can also pass in on this model property. We can pass in values to our composed UIs as well. We've got the concept of portaling in there. Other frameworks and libraries do have this. I'm not sure if they all do, but it's a concept of basically being able to move an element around the page, but have it act like it was in the original spot. Aurelia provides a whole heap of observation strategies for looking at property changes. We actually touched upon this before, sort of, with bindable, but we can also denote reactive properties here using observable. So some instances you have values that don't get user supplied passed in. They're not bindables, but you want them to work the same. So you want reactive properties. You want to know when they've changed. You would use observable. And you can see it's similar concept to bindable. You've got the name of the value, and then we've got this changed added to the end here. So Aurelia by default, we'll just assume property name followed by changed on the end. We've got the concept of effect observation. So this is really cool for observing, sort of heavy changes in your application. So see, we've got like a mouse moving example here, which is a really good example. I don't use this feature a whole lot, but it's great to have it there. We've got HTML observation, so we can observe elements, properties in there if we want to. Good for web components. Observer locator is a powerful observation system that allows us to observe property values, similar to observable, I guess. More manual if you prefer that. That's there. We also have the concept of watching data, which is, once again, one of my favorite features. I've used it a few times. We can create complicated or simple watch expressions in here to call values when they change. We can observe array lengths, as we can see here. Call a function when it changes. We can use computed functions in here. Got a whole bunch of examples in here with counters and whatnot. We won't go too deep into this, but this is definitely one area that I recommend you explore. As you can see, it's all quite intuitive, well documented. Aurelia has dependency injection. If when it comes to testing especially, dependency injection is just superior in my opinion. You can see it's a true dependency injection layer. You don't have to worry about, using elements in your HTML views or anything like that. It's a proper code level dependency injection layer. And I think that touches upon a lot of the templating component and important APIs in Aurelia. Aurelia comes with routing support. It comes with a validation library for doing form-based validation, all other forms of validation you can think of. We've got an internationalization library, doing translations, animation support. We've got a fetch client that wraps a native fetch API. Add some error handling and all that kind of stuff in there, working with JSON data. We've got an event meta system called Event Aggregator. So if you've worked with Vue, you would know that Vue has kind of an event aggregator system of its own. We can publish and subscribe to events. Aurelia has its own state management library called State. And it's arguably one of the most simplest and powerful state management libraries I've worked with. There's no complicated concepts to work with it. It's just all really simple, Aurelia-esque ways of working this state. Um, got well documented testing documentation, support for web components. Yeah, it just gives you everything that you need out of the box. You can see even in this documentation we have a few examples here, tutorials for you to go through and build and familiarize yourself with Aurelia. So I highly recommend these tutorials. The widget-based dashboard is good if you want to learn dynamic composition, and creating custom elements as well, because you can see, we create a whole bunch of different components and create a pretty fully featured dashboard application. And got the obligatory to do, which is another really good one that touches upon binding and listening to events, repeating over stuff using repeat for, which we touched upon before. We've got a real-time cryptocurrency price tracker, which uses the Coin Market Cap API. And that's showing the reactivity. It's also showing how to work with an API and playing values from it. So, I mean, we kind of went a little bit in depth on some aspects of it, and this video could have been a lot shorter. But that's Aurelia in a nutshell. You can see where possible, it tries adhering to specifications you're already familiar of, the syntax you're already familiar of. It's, the templating syntax for binding to values. It's dot bind in most cases if you're binding to values. The conventions in there just do things the way that most developers would want them to be by default. You don't have to be explicit about anything. I personally, I hate typing, so if I can save a few keystrokes, I mean, that's a win in my book. The developer experience is just unrivaled. Of course, there are some downsides that you'll hear about Aurelia, about, less job opportunities, smaller community. Even though I'm biased because I am part of that community, the core team. If you need help with anything, you come to the discourse, you come to our Discord server. You can ask the core team questions, and everyone is really kind and welcoming. There's no such thing as a stupid question. We'll gladly help anyone with any problems. How many frameworks and libraries can say that you can speak to the people actually creating those products and ask them for help and even suggest improvements? We get people suggesting improvements to our documentation and features to Aurelia all the time, and we're very open-minded and receptive to stuff, as long as it's obviously well thought out and specs. But yeah, Aurelia is one of those projects. I think there's no true equal. It's in a league of its own, and it may not be the most popular option, but I truly believe if you care about developer experience and wanting to get things built quickly, Aurelia is the way to go, to be honest. It's not a library, so it's a little bit heavier, but in terms of frameworks, you only use what you need, and you don't feel like you're being weighed down by, a sea of packages or anything like that. It's not heavy. There's things there if you need them, but you don't have to use them, and if you don't use them, then they just get shaken out, obviously, at build time. So that's Aurelia, and I highly encourage you to build something with it. And once again, if you need help, if you have any questions whatsoever, you just come to our Discord server or visit our discourse, create a forum thread, and type away, and we'll respond to you as soon as we can. And that's Aurelia, community, true open source project. So hope to see you there, and thank you for watching.